Hey there. Tonight we're stepping softly into a story wrapped in velvet and silence, one that flickers quietly behind gilded portraits and heavy court curtains. If you've ever stared at an old royal painting and wondered what happened to the girl inside, what she felt, what she feared, tonight's for you. So settle in, pull your blanket a little higher, and let's walk back gently through time. And if by the end you find yourself still awake and quietly curious, feel free to subscribe, only if you'd like. No pressure, no trumpet fanfare, just more sleepy stories from long, long ago. We begin in Vienna in the year 1673. It's winter, and behind the cold stone walls of the Habsburg palace, a young empress lies in bed. The room is silent save for the occasional rattle of wind against thick shutters. There are no cries of infants, no footsteps of nurses, no lullabies. Just a girl, no longer the golden child she once was, curled into herself. Breath shallow, pulse faint. Her name is Margarita Teresa. She is 21 years old. Her body has carried 6 pregnancies in 6 years. Only one child has survived. The others came and went like candle smoke, each one leaving a little more of her hollow. And yet, just a few years before this, just a whisper ago in court time, she was adored across Europe. She was the angel of Madrid, the tiny sovereign-to-be, the center of Las Meninas, the masterpiece of Diego Velázquez. There she stands still today, forever, 5 years old, wrapped in satin and innocence, staring outward with calm curiosity. Tourists come by the thousands to admire that painting. Most don't know what happened to the girl after the paint dried, but tonight you do. They called her radiant. Velázquez painted her in the soft light of morning, surrounded by attendants who bent at her every movement. Her pale gown glows, her cheeks are flushed. Her golden hair spills beneath a white veil. She looks unburdened, unknowing. And maybe she was for a while. But even then, even as a toddler in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, Margarita Teresa wasn't just a daughter. She was an investment, a promise, a bloodline. Because this is a story not just of a girl, but of an empire obsessed with its own reflection. Margarita was born into the House of Habsburg in 1651, a dynasty infamous not only for its power, but for the tight tangled web of its family tree. Her father, King Philip IV of Spain, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. That means Margarita's mother was also her cousin, and that Margarita herself was quite literally the product of generations of intermarriage. To the Habsburgs, this wasn't scandalous. It was strategic. By wedding within their own lineage, they believed they could preserve the purity of their blood, keeping their claim to both the Spanish and Austrian thrones untouchable. Or so they thought. Historians still debate whether these marriages were purely political, or whether court tradition and superstition also played a role. But one thing is certain: the Habsburg family tree didn't branch much, and the consequences, both genetic and emotional, would soon begin to show. For now, though, Margarita was seen as a healthy exception, a golden child in a crumbling house. Her birth was celebrated, not just because she was a girl of noble rank, but because she was strong, lively, beautiful. Her presence soothed her father, whose only son Charles was already showing signs of severe deformity and frailty. Charles would later go down in history as one of the most tragic kings of Europe, physically and mentally unfit to rule. But back then all eyes were on Margarita, the little light of Spain. Philip IV called her Mi Alegría, my joy. She toddled through palace corridors with ribbons in her hair, and no idea that half of Europe had plans for her womb. From infancy she was prepared for export, taught not to ask questions but to curtsy deeply, schooled not in what she wanted, but in who she would become. Her nursery was lavish, gold-inlaid mirrors, imported carpets, small chairs carved like thrones, but it was a training ground. Everything she touched had purpose. Her toys miniature courts, her books moral instruction, her daily schedule rigidly timed to mirror the habits of royal adulthood. You don't remember your 5th birthday, but Margarita's 5th year is recorded in oil and legend. It's 1656 when Velázquez paints Las Meninas. Margarita stands in the middle of the frame, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, a dwarf, a mastiff, and the artist himself. She is 5 years old, and she glows not in the way children usually glow, but with the luminous pressure of expectation. She is not playing, she is performing. And that moment, now frozen in a Madrid museum, would define her public image forever. The painting is full of contradictions. She is central yet passive. She is adored but silent. Even now, no one can quite say whether she's walking forward or standing still. That ambiguity suited the Habsburgs just fine. They needed a princess who could be anything to anyone. And Margarita would be just that. The moment her body could bear children, her fate was sealed. You'd think she had time to grow up, but the Habsburg court did not allow for leisure in its daughters. By the time Margarita was 12, negotiations for her marriage were in full swing. The groom, her uncle and cousin, Leopold the Forge, the future Holy Roman Emperor. He was 16 years her senior and already seated at the heart of Austrian power. For the Habsburgs, this match was ideal. It united the Spanish and Austrian lines. It tightened the bloodline further. And most importantly, it kept the empire within the family. By 14th, the Margarita was packed off to Vienna, leaving behind her country, her language, her dolls, and the sea air of Spain. The journey took weeks across the cold stone roads of Europe. And when she arrived, tired, dressed in silks, she hadn't chosen the city erupted in celebration. Vienna held balls, operas, and parades. But Margarita remained quiet. One tidbit tucked into court records, she refused to speak German, instead insisting on Spanish in the Austrian court, a gesture of cultural resistance or perhaps just homesickness disguised as formality. She brought dozens of Spanish attendants with her, recreating a mini Madrid inside the alien opulence of Vienna. And when she was presented to the court, they saw a vision, the young bride delicate and polite, trailing lace and good breeding. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the weariness behind her smile. The court paintings from this period depict her posture stiffening. Her eyes, once wide, begin to drop downward. This is where most fairy tales would cut to black: the royal wedding, the music, the roses. But for Margarita Teresa, it was only the beginning. You would think that after such a quiet goodbye, a life like Margarita Teresa's must have once been peaceful, protected, perhaps even cherished. And in some ways it was. There were silk-lined cradles and morning lullabies sung by women in velvet. There were formal lessons beneath painted ceilings and golden spoons carved just for her. But all of it, every luxury, every favor, was built on a foundation of purpose. Not her own, of course. That had been decided long before she was born. Margarita wasn't simply a beloved daughter. She was a child engineered by dynasty. In 1651, when she entered the world in Madrid, her parents already knew what her role would be. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was both Philip IV's niece and second wife, making Margarita the product of an uncle-niece union. In most families, that would raise eyebrows. In the House of Habsburg, it raised expectations. The Habsburgs believed that their strength came not just from conquest or coin, but from something far more intangible: blood. Their belief in dynastic purity wasn't a whispered superstition, it was policy. For generations they had married cousins, nieces, uncles, anyone who kept the bloodline untainted by outside influence. Over time, this obsession became tradition, and tradition became law. By the time Margarita was born, her family tree had begun to resemble a circle. Historians still debate just how much the Habsburgs understood the genetic consequences of such practices. Some argue they were aware but indifferent, trusting God to protect them. Others believe they genuinely thought dynastic marriages would ensure strong divine rule. Whatever the case, the reality was already taking root in Margarita's immediate family. Her half-brother Charles II, born just a few years later, would become perhaps the most infamous example of royal inbreeding in history. He suffered from a misshapen skull, oversized tongue, digestive issues, infertility, and a host of mental and developmental impairments. Charles would eventually rule Spain, but barely, and he would die without an heir, bringing the Spanish Habsburg line to a tragic close. But before him there was Margarita, and for a moment she seemed like the family's saving grace. While Charles was sickly, Margarita was glowing. She was robust, lively, graceful traits the court clung to desperately. She became a symbol of hope in a dynasty riddled with anxious whispers. Her mere presence steadied the atmosphere in the royal palace, particularly for her father, who had buried multiple children before her. He called her Mi Alegría, my joy, and it wasn't just a nickname. It was a kind of prayer. Even as a toddler, she was used to lift spirits and silence rumors. When foreign ambassadors visited Madrid, Margarita was often paraded through court corridors, charming and polite in miniature gowns that mirrored her mother's. She wasn't old enough to speak in full sentences, but she was already serving the empire. In the great Alcazar Palace, she was treated like a little queen in training, but she was also, in every sense, a vessel meant to carry the weight of two kingdoms and one severely compromised bloodline. One particularly curious tidbit from court records: her nurses were given instructions not to speak casually in front of her. Every word she heard had to be proper rehearsed and politically neutral. They believed that a royal child's early exposure to tone and language could shape her temperament, and therefore her future usefulness. Imagine that, being cradled by someone who wasn't allowed to soothe you with spontaneous kindness. As Margarita grew, her instruction became more formal. By age 4, she was studying etiquette, gesture, and symbolic presence, how to walk without wrinkling a dress, how to receive a gift with measured delight, how to nod with conviction even when she didn't understand. Language lessons came next. Latin, of course, and Castilian Spanish. She learned religious doctrine by rote, not as a path to faith, but as a requirement of monarchy. Even her prayers were political. There was no idle play. There were instead rehearsals, small court dramas in which she played the bride or the queen, coached by governesses who had once trained her aunts and cousins. Her toys were symbolic: 2 gold-threaded dolls, a miniature throne room made from carved ivory, tiny books of psalms, with her name inked in elaborate script. Childhood was not a time of imagination. It was a prototype for duty. Still, to outsiders, she seemed radiant. In portraits from her early years, her cheeks are full. Her posture self-assured, her dress is impossibly intricate for a child. Artists competed for the chance to paint her. Foreign visitors praised her grace and obedience. And at court, whispers began to swell. This was the one, the golden child, the hope of Habsburg Spain. But within that gilded promise there was never a question of what she wanted. Margarita's future was set in stone before she could read her own name. She would marry to serve the empire. The only decision left was to whom and when. In 1659, when she was just 8, negotiations began in earnest. The Habsburg court wanted to secure its place on both the Spanish and Austrian thrones. And who better to guarantee that than Margarita, a healthy noble, and critically a direct blood descendant of both branches. The match proposed was to her uncle and first cousin Leopold I. He was 16 years older, and already rising in the imperial ranks of Austria. Their shared ancestry would only strengthen the bond politically, at least. The family called it a natural alliance. In private, some courtiers were less enthused. One Viennese advisor reportedly muttered that the family tree had roots, but no branches. Still, the match moved forward. Letters were exchanged. Gifts were sent. Portraits were shared between courts. Margarita, meanwhile, continued her lessons. No one explained to her why these new paintings of distant men kept arriving, or why her tutors had begun to emphasize Austrian customs in their instructions. But she was observant. and very little escaped her. At 10, she wrote a letter to a court attendant, asking if she would still be allowed to pray in Spanish when she was married. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes. Even then, she understood that her voice, her language might not survive the journey ahead. And so preparations continued. Her dresses were lengthened, her manners sharpened, her schedule adapted to match that of the Austrian court. And always the quiet understanding her life would not belong to her. It's hard to say how she felt about it. No diaries remain, and her letters were carefully monitored. But her early portraits begin to change around this time. Her smile fades a little. Her eyes begin to drift away from the viewer, as though she's listening for something outside the frame. In one portrait, painted just before her departure, she's shown holding a fan across her chest, not open, not closed, just resting there quietly. It's symbolic art, historians say, a gesture of readiness, a shield of silk. Whatever it meant, she would soon leave everything familiar behind. And so we inch closer to the edge of childhood, and the beginning of something far more complicated a journey, not just across Europe, but across identity. Because soon Margarita would trade her Alcazar cradle for a foreign bedchamber, her Spanish lullabies for Austrian ceremony, her dolls for an emperor, and the rest would follow. The last time she walked the stone halls of the Alcazar as a child, her shoes were velvet and silent, but her thoughts were louder than anyone guessed. You can almost picture her, the hem of her brocade skirt brushing past tiled walls, eyes flicking up to the painted ceiling where saints and angels look down forever still. By now, she was already a symbol more than a girl. No one asked what she wanted, not her tutors, not her maids, not even her father. He adored her, yes, but adoration in royal courts was not the same as freedom. It was a kind of glorified containment, velvet-lined and gold-trimmed, but a cage nonetheless. Back in Madrid, Margarita's days had become ritualized rehearsals. She woke early often before the sun had warmed the narrow windows of her chambers. There were no lazy mornings wrapped in blankets or idle dreams about the outside world. The royal schedule was precise. She was bathed, dressed, and presented like a sacred relic. Even her posture at breakfast was subject to comment. Shoulders back, hands, delicately cupped eyes, cast just low enough to seem humble but alert. Her education was comprehensive, but not expansive. She studied languages, Spanish, Latin, and a bit of Italian, not for exploration, but for diplomacy. Her lessons in theology were rigid, memorized and performed. There were no open-ended questions, no encouragements to wonder why. Religion wasn't something you felt. It was something you displayed like good manners or a well-tied corset. Every day was a pageant of correctness, a soft training ground for one eventual goal to marry into power and behave perfectly while doing so. Historians still argue whether Margarita understood the weight of her grooming or simply absorbed it as normal. Perhaps like many royal children, she mistook performance for personality. Or perhaps she knew deep down that she wasn't learning for herself, but for whoever would one day claim her. There's a certain quiet tragedy in the tools of her childhood. One tidbit that survives in a court inventory lists a series of dolls made for Margarita, each dressed in a miniature version of a European court costume. Spanish, Austrian, French, even English. They were hand-stitched by court seamstresses and kept in their own gilded display case. From the outside, it might seem like an extravagant toy chest. But you, if you were standing there, might wonder, were they really dolls or subtle warnings? Each one dressed in the future, as if to say, this could be you. In between lessons and formal appearances, Margarita was occasionally allowed walks in the palace gardens, always under supervision. These weren't idle strolls. They were chances to be seen by visiting dignitaries to demonstrate health and grace. On one such occasion, it was recorded that she curtsied to a Flemish ambassador before even being introduced. The ambassador charmed remarked that she held herself like a sovereign twice her age. The court took that as a compliment, but you might hear something different in it. A child praised not for being young, but for already acting old. By age 5, Margarita had become the very embodiment of Habsburg continuity. The empire looked to her not with curiosity, but with expectation. So it's no wonder that Diego Velázquez, the greatest painter of the Spanish Golden Age, was summoned to capture her. Las Meninas was not just a portrait. It was a statement. In the painting, she stands at the very center, the world revolving around her small figure like a solar system. Attendants kneel and bow. The painter himself gazes outward, brush in hand. A great mirror reflects the vague outlines of her parents in the background, ghost-like. But Margarita, she is solid luminous, a symbol of stability in a court that was truthfully fraying at the edges. And yet, look closer. Her hands are folded but not relaxed. Her expression is poised but not playful. She's not smiling. She isn't laughing. Even at 5, she seems to understand she is being watched. And she must remain worthy of the watching. There's something deeply bittersweet about that. Most children in portraits are painted to look whimsical or joyous. Margarita was painted to look composed. The painting would later become one of the most studied in art history, debated in classrooms and galleries for centuries. But few viewers consider the real life of the girl at the center. They see her as a muse, a symbol, a masterpiece. Not a child being prepared for the slow unraveling of self. Back in the palace, she was not allowed to speak during adult conversation, unless spoken to directly. Her responses were rehearsed, measured. She had been trained to pause 3 seconds before replying to any nobleman's question, even if she knew the answer instantly. It was a subtle show of deference, a signal that she would never outshine, never interrupt, never be too quick. One could argue that this was refinement, but you may feel deep in your bones that it was erasure. As the years moved quietly forward, Margarita's awareness began to deepen. She started writing letters carefully dictated, always read before being sent. Some survive written in a formal but curious tone. One particularly revealing note was sent to her confessor. She asked whether it was wrong to miss the trees when one lives in a palace. The priest's response isn't recorded, but you can imagine it, can't you? Something pious, something practical, something that didn't answer the real question. By the time she was 10, her presence in court ceremonies had increased. She often stood beside her mother during receptions, mimicking posture and language. The queen would glance down at her, occasionally correcting her stance with the slightest nudge. But mostly Margarita stood still in ornamental promise in human form. Meanwhile, behind velvet curtains and through secret corridors, the negotiations for her marriage were accelerating. The idea of uniting the Spanish and Austrian crowns through her had become not just desirable, it had become essential. Her father, aging and increasingly melancholy, was said to gaze at her for long moments, during court dinners sometimes forgetting to eat. He had lost so many children. He had seen so much of his kingdom erode. Margarita was his last true hope, and in many ways she bore that silently. She rarely cried in public. She rarely stumbled in court shoes. Even when her corsets were tightened too far and her breathing turned shallow, she did not complain. Because by then she knew. The portraits changed again. Gone were the flounced sleeves and floral ribbons. Now she wore deeper colors, stiffer bodices. Her hairstyles became more structured, her jewelry more imposing. She was beginning to vanish into expectation. The smile became an arch of lips, no teeth. The eyes looked not at you, but somewhere just behind you. Not frightened, but already far away. And in this silent, structured atmosphere, the Alcazar prepared her for departure. Trunks were packed, tutors briefed. A new wardrobe was designed to match Austrian court protocol. The dolls were wrapped away. The Spanish sky faded into memory. She was 13 when the first farewell ceremony was held. It wasn't a wedding yet, just a departure rite. But for Margarita it was the beginning of the end of childhood. As bells echoed across the palace grounds, and the scent of myrrh and rosewater filled the hallways, she stepped forward, head held high, and you can almost hear the whispered sighs behind her. She's ready. Ready to leave. Ready to serve. Ready to disappear into another empire. But was she? That's something no document ever answers. The painting had already captured her long before any carriage carried her away. Las Meninas froze Margarita Teresa at the edge of knowing a still life of innocence, wrapped in royal responsibility. And yet, while that canvas remained unchanging, the real girl it portrayed was quietly evolving, growing taller, smiling less, holding still longer. She was 5 years old in oil and pigment, but 13 in the flesh, and the world had no intention of keeping her. It's strange, isn't it? How a portrait can outlive a person so completely, how it can become more real than the subject ever was. Today, art historians marvel over the balance of light and shadow, the unconventional composition, the philosophical debates about perspective. But back then, the painting served a more immediate purpose. It told Europe that the Habsburgs had something beautiful, something healthy, something promising. It was a political statement disguised as art, and Margarita, still very much alive, was expected to live up to it. By the time her 14th birthday approached, the deal was finalized. She would marry Leopold I, her uncle and cousin. He was 30, seated in Austria, and ready to receive her. The marriage contract was sealed with wax and ritual, a list of political terms disguised as a celebration. Leopold was said to be fond of the match. He had seen her portraits, admired her beauty, praised her education. In letters he called her "my little star from Spain." She had never seen his face, and so the departure was planned. That spring, Vienna sent a ceremonial escort to retrieve her, an entourage of diplomats' guards and noblewomen dressed in blue and silver livery. Margarita would travel with them across the continent, through the Pyrenees, across France, and into the cold forests of Central Europe. It would take nearly 2 months by carriage. She left behind her dolls, her tutors, and the dry Spanish air. According to court records, she took with her nearly 100 trunks of belongings, dresses, for every imaginable court occasion, dozens of lace collars, scented oils, hand-stitched undergarments, gold-inlaid prayer books, and multiple sets of jewelry, matched to different seasons, and of course a staff of Spanish attendants, who were meant to ease the transition, but who would instead become a subtle point of tension in the Austrian court. The departure ceremony was elaborate. She wore a dress of pearl-white silk embroidered with tiny golden fleur-de-lis and threaded roses. The court musicians played slowly, as if reluctant to push her away. Her mother wept quietly. Her father, aging and pensive, reportedly kissed her forehead and said only, "Serve well." Then the doors closed. The wheels turned, and Margarita Teresa left the only home she had ever known. Along the journey, the landscape changed. The sun of Spain gave way to clouded skies and mossy woodlands. In France, she was greeted with cautious politeness. In Bavaria, with curiosity. And in Austria, with thunderous orchestration. Vienna had been preparing for months. Balls, operas, feasts, all in her honor. The city was thrilled to receive their Spanish bride. But Margarita was not thrilled. She was polite, yes, graceful, obedient, but she remained emotionally distant. One tidbit from a lady-in-waiting's diary mentions that Margarita refused to remove her Spanish-style headpiece during dinner at the imperial table, even when gently asked. She believes herself still in Madrid, the woman wrote, and in spirit I believe she is. She would not speak German either. Instead, she insisted that all communication pass through interpreters, even when she understood perfectly. It was not ignorance. It was resistance, a quiet attempt to hold on to the parts of herself that hadn't yet been exchanged for protocol. The wedding took place in 1666, shortly after her arrival. It was a grand affair, musicians, fireworks, a procession of costumed nobles on horseback. But beneath the pageantry, the match was still what it had always been, a political contract. Her new husband was kind by most accounts. Leopold was reserved religious and intellectual. He wrote poetry in Latin and enjoyed scientific lectures. He reportedly called her Gretel, a soft diminutive. She called him uncle even after the wedding. Historians still debate the nature of their bond. Some believe it was affectionate, even tender in private moments. Others say it was always formal, always duty-bound. But what remains clear is this: it was never a marriage of equals. Margarita was still a teenager, Leopold a seasoned ruler. Their home was the Habsburg Palace, massive, cold, and steeped in tradition. It dwarfed the Spanish Alcazar, and its rituals were far more rigid. Austrian court etiquette required more silence, more stillness, more rules. There were formal greetings for every encounter, designated routes for each day's movement, and a precise schedule for meals and devotions. Margarita struggled with it, and the court noticed. Her Spanish attendants became a source of friction. They spoke in fast Castilian, followed Iberian customs, and clashed with Austrian servants. Rumors spread that Margarita spent entire afternoons alone writing letters to Madrid, refusing to engage with Viennese tutors. Her resistance was not overt, but it was constant. Small refusals, measured distance, a quiet ache for home. Still, she fulfilled her role. She appeared at public events. She posed for portraits. She sat beside her husband at state banquets. And eventually, inevitably, she became pregnant. She was 16. The pregnancy was announced with celebration bells, ringing across Vienna, messengers dispatched to Madrid. But Margarita herself was unwell. The symptoms came early: fainting spells, nausea, weakness. Midwives hovered constantly. Her appetite faded. Her complexion paled. And the whispers began perhaps she was too delicate after all. Perhaps she was not so sturdy as she had seemed in oil paint and court parades. The child, a boy, died in infancy. Still, Margarita remained dutiful. She conceived again within a year, then again, and again. Of the children she bore, only one survived, a daughter, Maria Antonia. The rest were lost, sometimes within days, sometimes in the womb. Each loss wore her down further. Her letters, which had once been tightly formal, began to carry a different tone, less polished, more searching. In one she wrote simply, "I feel as if I am fading." And fade she did. By the end of 1672, Margarita was mostly confined to her chambers. She rarely appeared in public. Her skin turned translucent, her voice softened to a whisper. Physicians bled her, dosed her, prayed over her. Nothing helped. In early 1673, pregnant once again, she fell into a prolonged fever. The child did not move. Margarita, now too weak to rise, began murmuring in Spanish to attendants who no longer understood her. She died quietly. Her body was later discovered to still carry the remains of her unborn child. She was 21 years old. Leopold mourned her deeply, at least according to official court statements. But within a few months, the empire required him to remarry. Margarita's memory began to dim in Austria. Her belongings were distributed. Her portraits moved into back rooms. Her Spanish attendants dismissed. And yet in Madrid she remained La Infanta Eterna, the eternal princess, the girl from Las Meninas. And perhaps that's where the story should end. A gentle fade, a closing curtain, a final sigh. But it doesn't, because Margarita was not alone in her fate. She was not the first nor the last royal woman to be sculpted by bloodlines broken by duty and remembered only as a symbol. Her story, as haunting as it is, was just one chapter in a much older book. And so as we leave the cold halls of Vienna behind, we begin to trace a pattern that spans continents and centuries, a pattern of royal inbreeding carefully masked in pearls and parchment. Not just in Spain, not just in Austria, but everywhere dynasties clung too tightly to themselves. And so she went not with resistance, not with joy, but with the kind of stillness that's been rehearsed since birth. When Margarita Teresa boarded the carriage bound for Vienna, she left behind more than family and language. She left behind the last scraps of childhood. The Alcazar faded behind her like a dream, one woven of golden mirrors and silent maids, and ahead lay the frost-lined gates of the Habsburg, where titles carried more weight than names, and girls like her were polished to gleam, then quietly passed from one empire to another. The road itself was long and bitter. The journey across Europe took several weeks, winding from the warm stone cities of Castile, through the biting winds of the Pyrenees, across the muddy plains of France, and finally into the dense, damp forests of the Holy Roman Empire. Her traveling party was grand, dozens of noblemen, priests, attendants, musicians, doctors, but none of them were friends. At just 14, Margarita sat alone in her carriage, her lap covered in fine lace, her thoughts hidden behind a delicate fan. She didn't cry. That wasn't allowed. And if she missed the sound of Spanish bells or the scent of orange blossoms in Madrid's courtyards, she kept that to herself. Because from the moment she left the Spanish court, Margarita ceased to be simply a daughter of Spain. She became a diplomatic package, delivered with full ceremony and unspoken expectations. By the time she arrived in Vienna, the entire city had been prepared to receive her. Buildings were freshly painted. Streets were lined with musicians and garlands. Balls were planned operas composed, even coinage minted in her honor. The imperial court saw in her the physical embodiment of unity between Spain and Austria, both branches of the Habsburg dynasty, folded into one small, pale girl. And yet Margarita walked into Vienna, not as a princess discovering her future, but as a bride with no real choice. She was to marry Leopold I, her uncle and cousin, twice over. To the outside world, this union made perfect dynastic sense. It concentrated Habsburg power, tightened claims to the Holy Roman Empire, and reinforced the ideological purity of royal blood. To Margarita, though, it meant little more than losing her name in translation. Leopold at 30 was quiet and devout. He was a scholarly man, well versed in theology, Latin poetry, and music. He kept a rigid schedule, fasted regularly, and had an almost monastic air about him, even as emperor. Margarita called him uncle, even after they were married, a linguistic quirk that historians still puzzle over. Some say it was a term of endearment. Others suggest it was a quiet act of resistance, a way of never fully dissolving her own identity. And their marriage, it was not cruel, but it wasn't romantic either. They shared common interests, particularly in music and sacred art. Leopold composed short pieces for the organ, and reportedly asked Margarita's opinion before finalizing them. She in turn offered soft approval and remained dutifully at his side during performances. Their private interactions were rarely recorded, but those that survive suggest a relationship defined by decorum, rather than affection. The royal bedchamber, like so much of court life, was governed by routine. Intimacy was expected, of course, not for pleasure, but for succession. Margarita's most important task was to produce heirs. This was not spoken aloud, but everyone knew. Her health, her fertility, her body, all were under scrutiny from the moment she arrived. Midwives were assigned before the wedding. A team of doctors took notes on her appetite, her posture, even her daily mood. No detail was too small when the future of the dynasty was at stake. And she tried. Oh, she tried. Within the first year, Margarita became pregnant. The city celebrated with fireworks and public prayers. But the child, a son, died within days of birth. It was a tragedy, but not an uncommon one. What was uncommon was how quickly Margarita was expected to recover. She became pregnant again the following year, and again after that. From age 16 to 21, Margarita carried 6 pregnancies. Of those children, only one, a daughter named Maria Antonia, survived infancy. The others were lost to miscarriages, stillbirths, or illness within weeks. Each time the court would grieve in whispers, then turn their gaze back to her belly, wondering when she would try again. Historians still debate whether Margarita's poor health was the result of inbreeding, the physical toll of constant childbirth, or both. Likely it was a combination. The Habsburg genetic line was already fragile, riddled with inherited disorders and compounded mutations. Margarita's own family tree included so many repeated ancestors that entire branches overlapped. She was genetically speaking more at risk than most. A tidbit from the Austrian court's medical journals noted that Margarita was often pale, of low appetite, and easily fatigued by light activity. Despite this, no one suggested she stop trying. No one suggested rest. She was 20 and Vienna still expected her to save the future. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that haunted her. Margarita was homesick. Her letters to family in Madrid, though filtered through court protocol, reveal a deep sense of isolation. She missed Spanish food. She missed her mother's voice. She missed the Alcazar gardens, even the dry wind that carried dust into the palace windows. In Vienna, she felt foreign even after years of marriage, and she never fully embraced the language. Though she understood German, she continued to use Spanish in private and insisted her attendants do the same. Court observers called this obstinate. Others more quietly called it brave, a soft act of defiance in a life otherwise scripted. Her only joy, it seems, was her daughter. Maria Antonia was born healthy with bright eyes and strong lungs. Margarita doted on her. She chose her fabrics by hand, requested Spanish lullabies to be sung at night, and despite resistance insisted that the girl be raised bilingually. But even this small victory was tempered by the pressure to produce a male heir. Maria Antonia, though beloved, could not inherit the imperial throne, and so Margarita was pushed again gently toward another pregnancy. She was barely 21 when her final child, a boy, died before birth. This time her body didn't recover. Fever set in. Her strength evaporated. For weeks she remained in bed, fading in and out of consciousness, murmuring in Spanish to an empty room. One physician's notes mentioned that she called for her father shortly before death. But Philip IV had died years earlier. Perhaps she didn't know. Perhaps she did and called him anyway. She passed away quietly in July of 1673. Her daughter was just 3 years old, and the court, already bracing for political fallout, shifted forward. Leopold remarried within months. The empire needed heirs. The Habsburg machine, built on marriages and mourning, could not pause. Margarita's portraits were moved to a side gallery. Her name, once whispered with so much hope, was gradually replaced by new alliances, new brides, new plans. But her legacy did not vanish entirely. In Madrid, she remained a symbol, especially in art. Las Meninas became a mirror, not just of royal power, but of its cost. Tourists still visit the Prado Museum every year, standing silently before the little girl in white, wondering who she was. Some never learn. Others do. And tonight you have too. Yet Margarita's story was not unique. What happened to her happened to others across other courts, other cultures, other centuries. The obsession with bloodlines, the quiet sacrifice of women, the belief that dynasties must survive at all costs. These were not ideas born in Vienna, nor buried there. So let us step forward gently now to see how this same story unfolded again and again in corners of history far from Spain or Austria. A pattern of power stitched into silk, embroidered with sorrow, and passed down like a crown no one wanted to wear. And so the gilded narrative continued quietly, obediently, with all the poise of a court-trained bride. For a time, it almost seemed as if Margarita Teresa had managed to fulfill her role without breaking. She showed up where required, nodded in all the right places, smiled faintly in public and mourned privately in silence. But beneath the powder and pearls she was fading. Her marriage to Leopold I, though occasionally described as affectionate, was never meant to nurture her spirit. It was a contract as stiff and cold as the court chairs she perched on during state ceremonies. And yet, even within such confines, there were gestures of something like kindness. Leopold was not known for passion, but he was known for restraint, for gentleness in tone, and for a sense of cultural appreciation. He enjoyed music, wrote music in fact, and Margarita, who had grown up surrounded by the elaborate ritual of Spanish liturgical song, shared that interest. They would sometimes sit in the quiet hours of the evening, he at the keyboard of a small chamber organ, she beside him with hands folded. He composed. She listened. A soft moment in a life otherwise structured by expectations. It's said that he wrote her a short hymn to the Virgin Mary, using a simple, repetitive melodic line because he thought her voice too delicate for complexity. Whether she ever sang it aloud is unknown. Historians still argue whether their relationship was truly affectionate or simply cordial. Some letters hint at endearment, pet names, polite pleasantries, mentions of shared walks or household discussions. Others, however, depict a cooler tone, particularly as Margarita's health began to decline. It's possible, and perhaps most likely, that both were true, a careful blend of public harmony and private distance shaped more by the expectations of empire than any natural rhythm between two people. Even as their companionship unfolded with decorum, the central expectation remained children. Margarita's life revolved around pregnancies, each treated with both hope and clinical precision. Imperial physicians monitored her constantly. After each childbirth, successful or not, she was examined, documented, and quietly urged to recover quickly. The cycle left little time for healing, either physical or emotional. Between these pregnancies, Margarita continued to fulfill her imperial duties. She attended Mass daily, participated in courtly receptions, and maintained an extensive wardrobe of ceremonial garments. Her days were as embroidered as her gowns, filled with the ornamental necessities of queenship. She smiled on balconies. She bowed to ambassadors. She signed letters with formal blessings. And slowly behind it all, her strength began to ebb. One court document mentions that her meals became increasingly small, often consisting of broth-candied almonds and boiled chicken. Her corsets were loosened. Her walks grew shorter. At public events, she leaned on attendants for balance. Still, she said nothing. Complaining would have been unbecoming of an empress, and Margarita had been trained since infancy never to show her discomfort. There's one particularly poignant tidbit recorded by a visiting noblewoman during a musical evening at the Habsburg. Margarita was seen holding her daughter Maria Antonia on her lap, rocking slightly in rhythm with the music, though the child was already nearly too large to be held that way. A moment of motherly tenderness out of place amid the marble busts and gilded archways. And it lasted only a minute before a court official whispered something to her, and the child was passed off to a nurse. Because even love in that place had a time limit. Still, she persisted. She continued to write letters, many of them formulaic, some of them unusually warm. In one to her former governess in Madrid, she wrote, "I wear the clothes of an empress, but I sometimes dream I am still running through the orange grove near the fountain. The trees did not ask anything of me." The letter ends there, perhaps deliberately. There were no orange groves in Vienna. The seasons turned, and each winter grew harder. Her immune system weakened by constant pregnancies, and a likely inherited fragility began to fail. Coughs turned into fever. Headaches became migraines. A faint bruise lingered for weeks instead of days. And yet the palace continued to function as if everything were fine. Balls were held. Guests were entertained. Political papers were signed. Margarita's suffering remained invisible. Scholars have long questioned why the court did not intervene more directly, why no one seeing her decline insisted on rest or withdrawal from court life. But this too was part of the machinery. Queens were not allowed to crumble. They were meant to glow gracefully until they vanished. Margarita did not vanish all at once. She disappeared inch by inch through miscarriages, through nights of unrelieved pain, through hours of forced stillness, while others spoke for her. Each day took a little more, and each day she gave it. She was in her own way faithful to the Habsburg image, pure, modest, quiet, loyal, but not invincible. By the time she reached her final pregnancy, she was already too frail to walk unaided. Her letters had dwindled. Her household staff had grown increasingly silent. Physicians came and went with little hope in their eyes. The only remaining wish, it seems, was that she deliver the child and live long enough to be seen blessing it before death. But the child did not live, and neither did she. July 1623. The rooms were hot. The air was heavy. Margarita Teresa slipped away in silence, attended only by a handful of nuns and her chief physician, who recorded the moment without embellishment. She was 21 years old. Her daughter Maria Antonia was taken into the care of tutors and nurses. Her husband Leopold I issued formal mourning orders, but remarried within months. The empire required heirs, and grief, though expected, was not permitted to linger, and thus the contract was fulfilled. But the sadness of Margarita's life lies not in its end, but in its entire architecture. From the moment she could sit upright, her body belonged to policy. Her thoughts were filtered, her voice measured, her choices orchestrated. She lived beneath a portrait of herself, a symbol of unity and brightness, while her real self slowly dimmed behind silk curtains. Still, her story does not close here, because Margarita was not the only royal girl traded for treaties, not the only one raised to perform rather than live. And while the Habsburgs made this practice infamous, they were far from alone. So let's move quietly now away from Vienna's echoes and into another time, another place. Let's trace this strange tradition where blood was counted more precious than breath, and royal girls were raised not to rule but to reinforce a name. We've seen how it looked in white satin. Next, we'll see how it looked in gold. There's something especially cruel about repetition. When a sorrow happens once, it feels singular. When it happens again and again without pause, without mercy, it begins to feel designed, like the world itself is conspiring to extract something from you until there's nothing left to give. That was the rhythm Margarita Teresa came to know, a cycle so precise and punishing, it barely needed to be spoken aloud. Conceive hope, wait, lose, recover, repeat. By the time she was 16, Margarita had already endured her first pregnancy. The court buzzed with cautious optimism. A healthy heir would solidify not just her position, but the entire Habsburg vision. Midwives were assigned. Holy relics were placed near her bedside. A bishop blessed her belly. All the rituals were in place. And then the child died. Not immediately, but swiftly enough that no baptism could be performed. No name was given. The bells that had been prepared to ring in celebration were silent. Still, no one faltered in their expectations. Margarita was young. There would be others. A second pregnancy followed just months later, and then a third. The numbers vary in the records. Some say 6, others 7. But the rhythm remains the same, a brief moment of anticipation followed by private mourning. No funerals were held. These were not children, they said, but failed beginnings. And Margarita. She bore each loss with the kind of dignity that courts mistake for strength. She dressed, she appeared at Mass, she thanked visitors for their concern, even as her body slowly collapsed from the inside out. Historians still debate the exact causes of her failing health. Some point to the intense physical strain of repeated childbirth without recovery. Others blame the inbreeding that defined her lineage, her tightly coiled DNA carrying the subtle errors of generations, marrying within the same small circle. It's likely a combination of both. The Habsburg jaw, so famously caricatured in later portraits of Charles II, wasn't just cosmetic, it was skeletal evidence of genetic narrowing. And Margarita's own features, while praised for their delicacy, may have hinted at the same fragility. One surviving medical note describes her skin as translucent and her pulse as thready. She fainted easily. She had frequent headaches, digestive issues, and periods of extreme fatigue. And yet the prescriptions remained the same: rest prayer and try again. In quieter corners of the court, people began to whisper. Would she survive another pregnancy? Would the Empress produce the male heir the dynasty so desperately needed? But these questions weren't asked aloud. Instead, they hung in the air like incense, unavoidable cloying, and never truly addressed. Meanwhile, Margarita withdrew further. Her once formal letters became sparse, often written in shaky script, sometimes signed only with initials. She spent more time in her bedchambers, shaded from the light, tended to by a dwindling staff of loyal Spanish ladies-in-waiting. Many had already returned home. Those who remained knew not to speak unless spoken to. Her only source of sustained joy by most accounts was her daughter Maria Antonia, her fourth child and the only one to survive. The girl was healthy-spirited and looked more like her father than her mother. Margarita dressed her carefully, instructed her tutors personally, and insisted she be exposed to both Spanish and German customs. Perhaps she hoped that Maria Antonia might one day succeed, where she had quietly failed, not in childbirth, but in choice. There's a touching tidbit recorded by a court musician on one of Margarita's better days. She requested a lullaby she remembered from childhood, the same song her mother used to sing in the gardens of the Alcazar. She asked for it not for herself, but for her daughter. And when the final notes faded, she reportedly said, "Now she will remember something of Spain, even if I do not tell her." But time was no longer on Margarita's side. Her final pregnancy in early 1673 brought with it a fever that would not break. Doctors were summoned. Sacraments were prepared, prayers whispered at every hour. The child within her had already stopped moving, and Margarita herself, drifting in and out of consciousness, spoke less and less. Those at her bedside said she sometimes addressed her mother. Other times she seemed to be counting something quietly with her fingers against the bedsheet. Perhaps the children she had lost. She died that summer in the oppressive heat of July. She was just 21. Her body, wrapped in white and gold, was laid out with ceremonial dignity. The church bells tolled softly. The court entered a period of formal mourning. But the machinery of empire could not pause for long. Leopold remarried less than a year later. The need for heirs persisted. And Margarita. She faded from official memory almost immediately. Portraits of her were moved to side chambers. Her name was spoken less often in court. Her story, like those of many royal women, became a footnote in dynastic chronicles, useful only when discussing the family tree, rarely remembered as a person, with a life, a voice, a quiet ache that no one wanted to name. But there is something deeper in this story than sadness. Because as much as Margarita was consumed by a system larger than herself, she was not alone in this fate. Across palaces and periods in languages and lands far from Vienna, her story echoes, resonating through the lives of other women, who were raised not to live but to serve. This is not just about one empress. This is about a pattern. So let's leave Vienna now, just for a little while, and trace this thread backward and sideways across time. Let's see what royal bloodlines demanded of other women in other courts under other suns. In the next chapter, we step into ancient Egypt, where love and lineage were bound together in a most intimate knot, and where another young woman born with royal blood was expected to marry not for peace or power, but for preservation. You don't hear it at first, the silence, the great wide quiet that follows a life slipping away. But it was there in Vienna in the year 1673 as the court physicians slowly lowered their voices and stepped back from the canopied bed. Empress Margarita Teresa of Austria, once the shining jewel of two royal houses, had died. She was just 21, and she was still carrying her final child, a baby, who had never taken a breath. There would be no soft cries to follow, no coos, no lullabies, only stillness. Her life, so publicly arranged and carefully painted, had ended in a kind of quiet that no artist could capture, a whisper fading out beneath vaulted ceilings, watched by courtiers who had long stopped seeing the girl beneath the gown. She had been a child bride, a crowned mother, a symbol, a solution, but never not really a woman allowed to live by her own measure. The facts are stark and brutally simple. Margarita had borne 6 children in 6 years. Of those, only one daughter, Maria Antonia, survived beyond infancy. The others died within days or weeks or in the womb. Each labor, each recovery chipped away at what little strength she had. Her physicians noted it often in their records: pale complexion, persistent fever, chronic exhaustion. But nothing slowed the expectations placed on her. She was, after all, a Habsburg. Her death, while tragic, was treated with formality, not alarm. The machinery of court life continued as it always did. Official mourning was declared. Black crape draped the palace walls. Services were held. Leopold, her husband and cousin-uncle, observed the proper period of grief. He was said to be devastated, but also resolute. Within months he remarried, because the empire, you see, did not pause for heartbreak. And that, if you listen carefully, is the most heartbreaking part of all. The girl who had once stood at the center of Las Meninas, radiant and beloved, was now gone. Not dramatically, not in the blaze of scandal or war, but in the most feminine and quietly tragic way possible, dying to give birth. Or more precisely, dying in the attempt. There is something ancient in that rhythm. It stretches across history, this expectation that women, especially royal women, must bear pain and carry futures, and accept their stories being cut short. Maria Antonia, her only surviving child, was left motherless at just 5 years old. She would grow up under tutors, ministers, and nannies, trained to become yet another pawn in the dynastic game. She was married off to the Bavarian prince Maximilian II, Emmanuel, and bore a son named Joseph Ferdinand. For a moment the courts of Europe buzzed with renewed hope. Perhaps this child, Margarita's grandson, would unite the Spanish and Bavarian claims and secure peace. But he died at age 6. Typhoid, they said. And just like that, Margarita's line was snuffed out. The Habsburgs, once so confident in the purity of their blood, had found themselves trapped in a genetic cul-de-sac. Her brother, Charles II of Spain, famously disfigured and infertile, would die childless in 1700. His death would plunge Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession, a sprawling conflict over who had the right to rule a throne, now empty of heirs. All the marriages, all the treaties, all the calculated pairings, none had secured the future. The cost had been steep, and in the end the empire fractured anyway. Historians still debate whether Margarita's marriage to Leopold was necessary. Could another match, less genetically entangled, more diplomatically creative, have preserved the dynasty? Could more attention to her failing health have saved her life, or at least softened it? Or was she, like so many daughters of her house, simply born into an impossible mold? She left behind no letters, no memoirs, no diary scribbles to betray her thoughts. What we know of her inner world is distilled through whispers and artwork. She exists now in paintings and court records, in the memories of others. Even in Velázquez's Las Meninas, her most iconic image, she does not speak. She stands, she watches, she exists as a point of composition. And yet there is something haunting in the way she is rendered. Not just regal, but alert. Not just obedient, but aware. As if even at 5 years old she already understood that her presence was currency, that her body would one day be negotiated in rooms where she would not speak. The tidbit, often glossed over in formal biographies, is this: after her death, Her husband Leopold I remarried within 8 months. He would go on to have more children expand the imperial line and continue ruling for decades. His grief, whether sincere or ceremonial, did not slow the rhythm of state. The Habsburg machine, ever practical, did not break its stride. One wife gone, another found. One line extinguished, another pursued. And perhaps that's the quiet cruelty of dynastic legacy. It forgets faster than it mourns. But let's not end with bitterness. Instead, let's return just for a moment to the girl she once was, to Margarita, the child who loved music, who clung to her Spanish dolls on the journey to Vienna, who insisted on speaking her native language, even in the cold halls of the Austrian court. She wrote once through a court intermediary that she missed the smell of orange blossoms back home. A small detail, perhaps, but it's there, a flicker of warmth, a trace of a self behind the symbolism. She was more than a death in childbirth, more than a painted figure, more than a daughter sacrificed to politics. She was a girl who smiled, not because it was required, but because someone had made her laugh. She was a woman who held her baby longer than protocol allowed. She was in the end a reminder that every empire is built on people, not just plans. And so now, as we close this chapter, let's do so gently. Let her rest not just in state, but in peace. Let us remember her not for what she could not save, but for what she endured with grace. And now, with the weight of Habsburg velvet slowly fading behind us, we turn to other lands, other dynasties. Because the story of royal inbreeding does not end here. It stretches outward across seas and centuries. Next, we'll travel to the deserts and palaces of ancient Egypt, where another royal daughter, Cleopatra, was born into a similar fate, one of sibling marriages, divine lineage, and impossible expectation. But unlike Margarita, Cleopatra wielded power. She spoke for herself. She ruled in her own name. The game was the same, but the player, very different. You follow the thread now delicately, carefully out of the frosted chambers of Vienna, and into a much older world, one drenched in sandstone and sunlight. Here in the shifting heat of ancient Egypt, the pattern of royal inbreeding continues not as a mistake, but as divine policy. The bloodline wasn't just preserved, it was worshipped. And nowhere is that more striking than in the story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and perhaps the most mythologized woman in ancient history. Most people think they know Cleopatra. She's the seductress of Caesar and Antony, the woman with coal-lined eyes and a silver tongue. But before she became the queen of legend, she was a royal daughter, just like Margarita, born into a family where love was irrelevant and blood was everything. Cleopatra was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, by the time she was born in 69 BCE. And like the Habsburgs, the Ptolemies had a habit of marrying close, very close, siblings, uncles, cousins. The logic was divine purity, the belief that the ruling family descended from gods must not dilute its sacred blood with outsiders. The result? Generation upon generation of royal inbreeding. Marriages not forged in romance, but in fear, fear of contamination of outside claims of dilution. Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers, first Ptolemy III, then Ptolemy XV. She had no real choice in the matter. These were political unions meant to preserve tradition and power. But unlike Margarita, Cleopatra did something radical. She ruled. Even as she married her brothers, she pushed them to the side. When Ptolemy XV tried to wrest control from her, she raised an army and fought him for the throne. When Ptolemy XIV became inconvenient, he mysteriously died, likely poisoned. And so, for a time, Cleopatra ruled alone. Mainstream historians agree that Cleopatra was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, which none of her Ptolemaic ancestors had bothered to learn. She was also trained in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and politics. She held audiences with generals, scholars, and foreign envoys. And she did all this while performing the expected rituals of Ptolemaic queenship, worshipping Isis, appearing with divine headdress, offering her bloodline to the gods through incestuous marriage. But beneath all that ceremony, she walked a razor's edge. Because divine or not, the Ptolemaic line was weakening. The result of centuries of closed genetic loops was becoming evident birth defects, mental instability, short lifespans. While we don't have detailed medical records like we do for the later Habsburg's ancient sources, hint at physical and cognitive fragility among Cleopatra's siblings and cousins, it is not unlike what happened to Margarita's family, only wrapped in the trappings of divinity instead of Catholic devotion. And still Cleopatra maneuvered. When the Roman Republic began to collapse, she aligned herself first with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. Her children with them, Caesarion, and later 3 with Antony, were born not of sibling marriage, but political alliance. It was her way of stepping outside the bloodline, of trying to survive by bending the rules. But the world around her was changing faster than she could control. Rome invaded, Antony fell, and Cleopatra, like so many before her, found herself trapped by the very legacy she had tried to reshape. Historians still argue whether her death was suicide or staged execution, whether she died by snakebite or dagger or poison-laced fig. But the result was the same. Her children were captured, her kingdom annexed, and the Ptolemaic line extinguished. Her daughter Cleopatra Selene was raised in Rome and married off to a foreign prince. Her son Caesarion was executed. The bloodline that had ruled for 3 centuries ended with a whisper. And yet Cleopatra's legacy endured not as a cautionary tale of royal inbreeding, but as a woman of extraordinary intellect and ambition. That in itself is the most powerful contrast to Margarita Teresa. Where Margarita was folded into empire and forgotten, Cleopatra burst from hers and became legend. But even so, both were victims of the same belief that blood was destiny, and that royal daughters existed to serve it. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Cleopatra was the first in her dynasty to actively present herself as Egyptian, not just Greek. She wore traditional Egyptian dress, conducted state business in the local language, and participated in religious ceremonies as pharaoh. In doing so, she transcended her own bloodline's narrow expectations, if only briefly. She played both roles, the divine sister-wife of myth and the living ruler of a vast, crumbling world. And for a while it worked. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The gods of Egypt could not save her. The Romans had no need for bloodlines they didn't control. And so the curtain fell on Cleopatra, just as it had on Margarita, one with poison and gold, the other with fever and silence. Still something lingers, doesn't it? The same sense of inevitability, the same ritual of grooming a young girl for a life she didn't choose, of dressing her in titles and expectation, of letting her become a symbol, and then quietly letting her die when the symbol could no longer serve. And so, from Cleopatra's tomb to Margarita's bier, we begin to see the full shape of a history that repeats itself, not by accident, but by design. Royal daughters bound to family sacrifice and fate. But we are not done tracing this thread, for now we move eastward to a quieter palace, in a land where incense drifted through halls, and loyalty was measured in obedience. There, in 19th century Vietnam, another empress lived within the walls of power, but spoke little, and was rarely seen. Her name was Tudu. She did not fight wars. She did not rule alone. But her story too was carved by the dynasty she was born into, and the silence she was expected to keep. You've arrived now in a world wrapped in stillness. No oil portraits, no marble busts, no palace balconies dripping with gold leaf. Instead, there is the hush of inner courtyards, the slow flutter of silk panels in a warm breeze, and the sound of sandals softly brushing polished stone. Welcome to the Imperial Palace of Hue in Vietnam. Here in the quietest corners of one of Asia's most refined dynasties lived a woman whose voice was seldom heard, yet whose presence lingered across decades of change. Empress Tudu. She was not born royal. She was born Pham Thi Hang in 1810, the daughter of a respected scholar official. Her family had ties to the Nguyen dynasty's early foundations, which may have made her a desirable match. But it wasn't romance that brought her into the palace walls. Like so many women before her, she was chosen for her background, her poise, her promise of stability not courted, not wooed. When she married Prince Nguyen Phuc Mien Tong, who would later become Emperor Thieu Tri, she stepped into a role both exalted and invisible. Her new world was one of elaborate ritual and near constant observation. In the Confucian-structured court of Hu, hierarchy was absolute. There were rules for how to sit, how to address even one's own children, and how to move through a room in the presence of elders or emperors. Empress Tudu quickly learned what was expected to be silent, graceful, obedient, and perhaps above all distant. Her words were filtered through layers of formality, her desires quieted before they could ever become audible. But beneath this surface of ritual and restriction, something endured. Tudu was not merely ornamental. She was observant, intelligent, and acutely aware of the delicate balance within the imperial household. Over the years, she became a master of surviving without making waves. And as the years stretched on, she became something else entirely, the matriarch of a crumbling dynasty. She lived through the reign of her husband, then through the long rule of her son, Emperor Tujuk, who had no children of his own. When he died, a period of intense instability followed, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession, some reigning for just months. Meanwhile, the French began asserting colonial control over Vietnamese territory, and all the while Empress Tudu remained within the palace walls a figure of tradition. Calm and quiet power. Mainstream historical records portray her as a woman of great poise and inner strength. She rarely made political statements publicly, but behind the scenes her opinions carried significant weight. During the succession crises of the late 19th century, it was said that her counsel helped shape transitions and avoided more violent coups. She urged restraint, decorum, and continuity values she had lived by for decades. Still, her influence was always indirect. She could advise but never rule. She could witness but rarely intervene. And yet she did leave her mark. In At Dao, the Great Famine of 1885, when hundreds of thousands across northern Vietnam perished from starvation, Empress Tudu donated a large portion of her personal wealth to help the poor. This act of generosity, done quietly and without pomp, was a rare window into her humanity. She saw the suffering beyond the palace gates, and acted not with a decree, but with what little she could offer: silver rice and a ripple of compassion. That moment, often mentioned only in passing by textbooks, is a vital tidbit of her story. It reminds us that her silence was not indifference. Her restraint was not passivity. She lived under rules that demanded submission, but within those walls she carved out small spaces of meaning, of mercy, of choice. And she endured. While emperors were poisoned, exiled, or dethroned, she kept her seat. She lived through 5 reigns, witnessing French domination take hold and reshape the world around her. Most strikingly, she outlived nearly everyone who had once ruled over her. Her husband died. Her son died. Many successors came and went, but Tudu stayed. Historians still debate whether her longevity gave her true power or simply extended her burden. Was she in the end a ruler in all but name, or was she a ghost of an older order lingering on because no one dared challenge her dignity? What's clear is that her role was both revered and isolating. To be the Empress Dowager was to embody virtue, piety, and discipline, to be consulted, honored, but never embraced as an equal. She was a mirror for others' expectations, never fully allowed to express her own. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there, to live so long to watch history bend and twist around you, and yet never to take center stage. Tudu was like the still water beneath the bridge, quiet, reflective, always present, and yet so often ignored by those too focused on the waves above. She reportedly had a fondness for orchids, the kind that bloomed quietly in shaded courtyards. Orchids in Vietnamese symbolism suggest modesty, inner strength, and resilience. That she chose to tend them says something profound about how she found meaning. Not in ruling, not in recognition, but in the quiet act of cultivation, nurturing something delicate in a world of hardened ceremony. She passed away in 1901, aged over 90. Her death marked the end of an era of an unbroken link to Vietnam's pre-colonial sovereignty, of a woman who had been both a witness and an anchor to her court. She was given high honors, posthumous titles, and respectful memorials. But she was also in many ways buried beneath centuries of dynastic narrative. So tonight you remember her not as a figure in a textbook, not as a symbol, but as a woman. One who lived a full life within boundaries she did not choose. One who through quiet defiance and disciplined care made herself unforgettable without saying much at all. And as we leave behind the orchid-scented courtyards of Hue, our journey brings us back to the heart of Europe, to Austria, where another Habsburg daughter, far removed in time but eerily close in fate, would endure similar weight. Her name was Maria Ludovvika, and though she wore a different crown, the pressure was the same. Marry, endure, and bear heirs until your body said no more. Now you find yourself drifting back through the mists of Central Europe, away from the soft orchids of Hue, and into the marble corridors and chandelier-lit salons of Imperial Austria. The air here is cooler, more formal, threaded with the scent of beeswax old paper and a touch of lavender. This is Vienna again, the beating heart of the Habsburg dynasty. And tonight your quiet guide is another young woman, bound to royalty by blood and burden, Maria Ludovvika of Austria Este. She too will not live long. She too will be remembered for what she endured, rather than what she achieved. Maria Ludovvika was born in 1787 in Monza, then part of the Duchy of Milan. Her father was Ferdinand of Austria Este, a son of Empress Margarita Teresa, and her mother was Maria Beatrice of Modena. That made Maria Ludovvika not just noble, but Habsburg through and through. Her veins were filled with the same strategic heritage that had shaped Margarita Teresa's fate over a century before. She was educated in Italian courts, raised to honor discipline, devotion, and dynastic duty. And as always with women of such lineage, her life was never truly hers to live. At 18, she was married to her first cousin, Emperor Francis II, head of the Holy Roman Empire. Francis was a widower twice over, and Maria Ludovvika became his third empress. She was 20 years his junior, and while their union was described as respectful, it was far from romantic. She stepped into a role laden with expectations, provide stability, give birth to heirs, and support the emperor in a time of political upheaval. The Napoleonic Wars were shaking Europe to its roots, and Vienna was a place of both regal ritual and whispered fear. What makes Maria Ludovvika so intriguing, so human, is that she left behind letters, not declarations of state or proclamations of royal policy, but private thoughts, fragments of emotion that flicker like candlelight through the corridors of her brief, intense life. And what these letters reveal is exhaustion, resignation, a quiet despair that never had a public name. In one letter she writes of constant physical weakness, describing spells of faintness, headaches, and difficulty breathing. Another reveals her sense of isolation in court, where she was expected to smile graciously, even as her body and spirit were failing her. The formality of court life, which could sometimes be stifling even to seasoned royals, seemed to smother her entirely. She lamented that she was always on display, always expected to be joyful, even when her body cried out for rest. The historical fact remains stark. Maria Ludovvika died childless at the age of 28, her health ravaged by years of illness. Modern historians speculate that she may have suffered from tuberculosis or another chronic degenerative disease, worsened by the stress of her role and the pressures of continuous ceremonial obligations. The Habsburg court, still steeped in its traditional expectations of women, never adjusted its demands to her fragility. She was praised in death for her grace and strength, but rarely was it acknowledged just how much that grace had cost her. Historians still argue whether Maria Ludovvika was a tragic victim of her family's machine or a quiet reformer who used her position, however briefly, to influence her husband's policies. She was known to oppose Napoleon with fervor and reportedly encouraged Francis to resist the French emperor's overtures. Some accounts credit her with bolstering the morale of the Austrian elite during those uncertain times, but whether she did so from a place of conviction or simply obligation remains unclear. Like so many women in her dynasty, her personal beliefs were filtered through male advisors, state documents, and carefully edited public appearances. There is, however, one peculiar tidbit in her story that catches the imagination. Maria Ludovvika reportedly developed a fondness for miniature clockwork toys, complex mechanical figurines that danced, sang, or played music with the turn of a tiny key. These toys were a marvel of the time, intricate pieces of craftsmanship that captivated courtly audiences. But Maria Ludovvika didn't just admire them, she collected them. And some said she would sit alone for hours, watching a ballerina twirl endlessly in a glass dome, or a nightingale flutter its tin wings. Perhaps in those clockwork dances, she found a strange kinship, endlessly performing delicate and ultimately powerless to escape the rhythm imposed upon them. Imagine her sitting in her rooms, pale and breathless, dressed in layers of velvet and lace, the hum of gears filling the silence. Outside, Austria was crumbling beneath the weight of foreign invasions and internal unrest. Inside, an empress watched a music box perform, unable to stop its song, yet unable to leave the room. That image is worth pausing on, not because it's dramatic, but because it's small. It reminds us that the pain of royal women was often not about great betrayals or public humiliations. Sometimes it was the slow, steady drip of expectation, the hours spent standing when one needed to lie down, the ceremonies attended when one wanted to disappear, the forced smiles, the miscarriages mourned in private, the letters never sent. Maria Ludovvika's funeral was a grand affair. She was buried in the Imperial crypt in Vienna, alongside centuries of Habsburg dead. Her sarcophagus is ornate, crowned with a cold sculpture that attempts to capture her dignity. But unlike Margarita Teresa, she left behind no child. No dynasty traced itself back to her womb. In the eyes of her family, her value had expired, and within a year, Francis remarried once again. That, too, is part of the Habsburg mold, the swift replacement of wives, the endless pressure on women to be fertile, agreeable, and uncomplaining. Whether they broke under the weight of childbirth or the strain of expectation, the machinery never stopped turning. A new name, a new dress, a new woman filling the same role. There's something particularly haunting about Maria Ludovvika's life, because it almost disappears between the pages of better-known events. She didn't reshape empires. She didn't leave a legacy of reform or war or rebellion. But she lived, she suffered, and she left behind just enough to let us know that she was tired, that she wanted something else, that perhaps just once she would have liked to wind the key of her own destiny, rather than play out someone else's song. So we remember her tonight not as a queen or a policy figure, but as a person, a young woman who carried her lineage like a weight she could not set down, a dancer who never chose her choreography, a clockwork empress whose springs ran out too soon. And as the music of her final toy fades into the velvet air, We continue our journey this time to a land far to the east, to a place where political marriages shaped not only dynasties but identities. In the ancient courts of Japan, royal daughters too were assigned their roles from birth. But unlike their European counterparts, they often disappeared not just from history, but from the very names they once carried. Let's follow their footsteps next. You now drift eastward, far from Vienna's carved pillars and heavy drapes, to a world of silence, wrapped in brocade and incense. You've entered the imperial courts of Japan, where time itself once moved in slow, measured bows, and where words were more dangerous than blades. Here behind paper walls and beneath lacquered ceilings, the daughters of emperors lived lives so veiled in protocol and isolation that even their names were sometimes erased. Tonight, you're following the fragile thread of those forgotten women, imperial princesses of feudal Japan, raised not for freedom but for ceremony, not to be known but to be used. In medieval and early modern Japan, imperial daughters were never destined for power. The emperor, seen as divine, reigned but rarely ruled power, belonged to the shogunate, the military elite. And yet the emperor's bloodline had to be preserved, honored, displayed. Royal daughters thus served as living links between noble houses and religious purity. Their lives were offers, political, spiritual, symbolic. They were given to temples to court alliances, or to ceremonial marriages that never included love. Their names often changed upon entry into a new role, like stepping into a mask that would never come off. A striking example comes from the Heian period, when royal daughters were sent as imperial priestesses, sayo, to the Ise Grand Shrine. These women, often barely out of childhood, were isolated in a palace known as the Saiku, away from their families to serve the sun goddess Amaterasu, in total ritual purity. They were not allowed to marry. They were not allowed to speak freely. Every action they took, from the way they walked to how they held a fan, was dictated by sacred custom. They lived in luxury, yes, but a luxury of detachment, of ceremonial loneliness. One Sayo Princess Oku was only 12 when she was appointed. She remained in service for over a decade before being dismissed after her brother's political downfall. She never married, and her later years were spent in quiet exile. Her poems, a rare personal echo, speak of longing, fading youth, and the sorrow of watching cherry blossoms fall year after year with no hand to hold. In one verse she writes, "I was told I was a flower, meant to be admired, not touched, but even petals feel the wind." There in a single line lies the entire fate of imperial daughters, meant to be admired, not lived. This system of ritualized isolation wasn't just confined to priestesses. Throughout the Edo period, 1603–1868, daughters of the emperor were often married off to high-ranking daimyo feudal lords, not to secure affection but to solidify allegiance. These women were renamed, relocated, and re-educated to reflect the customs of their husbands' domains. Some were allowed to write letters home, but many were discouraged from maintaining close ties with their original family. They became cultural ambassadors of a court that had no military power and whose authority was largely symbolic. And in that role, they were expendable. The historical fact remains many Japanese imperial daughters were renamed upon marriage or ordination, and their birth names disappeared from records. Even tomb inscriptions use their adopted titles, making it difficult for historians to trace their full identities. These renamings weren't accidents. They were systematic efforts to erase personal identity in favor of dynastic function. It was as if once they stepped into their role, the girl they once were ceased to exist. But perhaps the most quietly unsettling part, their pain was rarely recorded. There are no court chronicles detailing their daily grief, no published letters from mistresses to friends about the heartbreak of exile or longing. What we have instead are temple rosters, Marriage contracts and a scattering of poetry, always metaphor, always restraint. Their stories are told in silences between lines, in the way a plum blossom appears in winter, or how a crane turns its head away in a painting. Historians still debate the extent to which these women were passive victims or quiet strategists. Some argue that behind closed fusuma doors, royal daughters cultivated private influence, managing estates, guiding younger women, or even directing temple finances. Others insist they were prisoners in gilded solitude, allowed no voice except that which reinforced their family's image. The truth may lie somewhere between. A woman may hold power and still long for freedom. A priestess may be sacred and still be lonely. One surprising tidbit: the Imperial Court of Japan during the Edo period maintained an entire staff of female calligraphy instructors, chosen specifically for their elegance, voice tone, and ability to model correct emotion through brushstroke. Princesses were expected not just to write beautifully, but to perform beauty through writing. Even their grief, when expressed in ink, had to follow aesthetic rules. Too many tears in the poem, it was seen as disruptive. Too little cold. The goal was always balance, never authenticity. Now imagine living your whole life this way. Every thought pre-measured, every expression calibrated. A lifetime of pages where even sorrow had to follow the rhythm of brushstroke and seasonal metaphor. It's not hard to see how the spirit might quietly fade, even as the body stood straight. One such princess, born in the early 18th century and renamed Shunkoin, lived as a nun empress after being sent to a convent upon her husband's death. Her daily routine involved chanting ceremonial tea service and hours of ink copying sutras. She lived into her 70s, far longer than many of her peers, and became a respected abbess. But even her writings speak in symbols, never directly. In a surviving line she writes, "In stillness I grew like moss upon the temple stone, a life defined not by action, but by quiet, slow accumulation of years of discipline, of unspoken memories." And so you sit now beside her, in that shadowed temple courtyard. The bell tolls faintly in the distance. The smell of sandalwood lingers on your sleeve. There is serenity here, yes, but it is not the serenity of choice. It is the serenity of surrender. These Japanese imperial daughters may have worn different robes than the Habsburgs, but the story underneath is hauntingly familiar girls, born into dynasties, shaped into symbols, and asked to carry centuries of tradition on fragile shoulders. Some bent, some broke, some simply disappeared. But for a moment tonight they are remembered not as titles, not as ceremonial tokens, but as young women with names they did not choose, and lives they could not rewrite. Next, we return to the heart of the Middle East, where royal blood and dynastic pressure often took a different shape, but rarely offered more freedom. Across cultures, across empires, the thread remains: royal daughters bore the weight of lineage far more often than they bore joy. Now your steps shift west again, though not toward Europe. This time they carry you through silk-lined corridors and cedar-scented halls into the royal compounds of the Middle East, where dynasties rose and fell under calligraphic banners and divine mandates. Tonight your path winds through the history of royal daughters in the Islamic world, particularly within the Ottoman Empire, where women behind the veil were anything but invisible, and yet were still bound to a life shaped by bloodline and expectation. When you picture the Ottoman Empire, perhaps you see minarets, tiled courtyards, and the grand silhouette of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. But behind those imperial walls lived the women of the harem, the domestic quarters of the Sultan, both feared and misunderstood by Western imaginations. Among the many women housed there were not just concubines, but royal daughters, sultanas born of royal blood, and destined to serve their family, not through sword or crown, but through marriage. These princesses were raised in luxury, yes, surrounded by tutors in poetry, music, embroidery, and Quranic recitation. But their freedom was sharply limited. They could not marry at will, and when they did, It was to men chosen for political alliance, never for affection. A sultana's wedding was not a celebration of union, but a transfer of power. Her husband would now rule a distant province on behalf of the sultan, and she would accompany him as a symbol of imperial oversight. One historical example is Mihrimah Sultan, the beloved daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent. Mihrimah, born around 1522, was not merely a passive figure. She wielded considerable influence at court, advising her father and later her brother. Yet even she was married off at 17 to Rustem Pasha, a powerful but much older vizier. While the marriage was politically advantageous, it was not romantic. And though Mihrimah remained close to her family, especially her mother, the formidable Hürrem Sultan, she still lived within the constraints of a system where her personal desires came second to dynastic strategy. That tension between power and powerlessness defined the lives of many Ottoman princesses. They often had more education and privilege than most women in the empire, but they were confined in golden cages. Forbidden from remarrying, if widowed, many spent decades in semi-exile, managing estates, supervising charitable works and raising children, without the freedom to shape their own futures. A lesser-known fact is that many sultanas funded major public architecture projects, mosques, schools, soup kitchens, not out of spiritual devotion alone, but because it was one of the few arenas where they could leave a lasting mark. These were quiet legacies often attributed to male architects or patrons, but they tell us something powerful. These women found ways to write themselves into history, even when denied official titles. And yet even those small freedoms came at a cost. The historical fact remains Ottoman royal daughters were banned from remarrying after their first husband died, regardless of age or circumstance. This policy, solidified by the 16th century, effectively ensured that a princess could only serve one political purpose. Once that purpose was fulfilled, once she had married and perhaps birthed a child, she was expected to retire from public life. Historians still argue whether this rule was meant to protect the dignity of the dynasty or simply to reduce political risk. Some say it prevented princesses from becoming pawns in future power struggles. Others believe it reflected a deeply patriarchal fear that a woman with multiple alliances might destabilize the very structure of the empire. And here comes a tidbit that sounds almost too curious to be true. In the 17th century, some sultanas, widowed, young, and confined for life, took to raising exotic animals within their private gardens as a way to pass the time and exert some control over their limited domains. A diary entry from a palace steward mentions one such princess who kept a peacock, 2 gazelles, and a rare white monkey as companions. It might seem eccentric, but in a world where nearly every human interaction was governed by protocol, these animals offered unfiltered companionship. They didn't bow. They didn't scheme. They didn't care if she had borne sons. These women's lives weren't tragic in the theatrical sense. Their stories didn't always end in madness or blood. More often they faded quietly like the scent of jasmine at dusk, still there but out of reach. Their pain was subtle, structural, a ceiling that never cracked, a boundary that never moved, the kind of sorrow you don't notice until you realize you've never once been allowed to make a real choice. One particularly poignant story is that of Fatma Sultan, daughter of Ahmed III, who married at the age of 16 and became a widow only a few years later. Denied remarriage, she spent the rest of her life in quiet retreat, becoming a patron of poetry and theology. Her letters to her nieces reflect deep wisdom and a touch of longing. In one she writes, "They call us candles of the dynasty, but even candles wish to burn where they choose." There's a soft defiance there, a sense that even within the tightest constraints, a woman could carve out a space for herself, even if only in metaphor. The physical spaces these women occupied, stone chambers, with wooden lattice windows called cafes, were designed to allow light and air while obscuring vision. From inside, they could see the gardens, the sky sometimes even the Bosphorus in the distance, but they could never step beyond those lattices without escort or permission. A daily reminder that beauty, vision, and desire could be glimpsed, but never held. And so you sit beside one now, perhaps Fatma, or perhaps an unnamed princess, whose records didn't survive. The evening call to prayer drifts in through the carved windows. The light grows golden, then blue, then fades. The monkey scampers quietly along a roof beam. A page turns in a poetry collection. And another hour of waiting passes. In so many dynasties, daughters were the price of peace. Their lives were measured in alliances, their bodies treated as vessels of succession. Whether in Spain, Japan, or Istanbul, they were taught from birth to bend but not to break. And perhaps that's the most haunting part they rarely did. They endured, quietly, elegantly, invisibly, but not tonight. Tonight you've walked their corridors, sat beside their silences, heard the scratch of their pens and the soft rustle of their robes. You've remembered them not for the palaces they adorned, but for the lives they tried to live within them. And as we prepare to return to Europe for one last wide-lens view of royal inbreeding and dynastic pressure, take one last look through the lattice. Someone may have once watched from this very spot, longing not for escape, but simply to be seen. Now you pull back from the winding halls of Istanbul, from the cedar and sandalwood scent of cloistered daughters, and rise into the wider sky of history. It's time to see the pattern, not the isolated tales of suffering or endurance, but the full tapestry they weave. Because what happened to Margarita Teresa, to Princess Oku, to Empress Tudu, to Mihrimah and Shunkoen, these were not exceptions. They were the rule. The slow-burning, gilded rule of royal inbreeding dynastic obsession, and the quiet cost borne generation after generation by daughters whose greatest misfortune was being born with names too precious to waste on freedom. Let's widen the lens now. You begin to see the same notes echoing in unexpected places. In Bourbon France, in the Rajput kingdoms of India, in the tsardoms of Russia. These weren't simply cultures keeping power within a family. They were dynasties building cages out of bloodlines, cages where every child was either a solution or a sacrifice. In Bourbon France, for example, royal inbreeding wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. King Louis XIV's family tree reveals a latticework of cousins, marrying cousins, brothers' daughters, marrying uncles and children raised, knowing that romance had no place in their future. One of the most tragic cases was Marie-Louise d'Orléans, who was married off at 17 to Charles II of Spain. Yes, that Charles II, Margarita Teresa's younger brother, the final Habsburg king whose inbred features and cognitive struggles became a subject of whispered horror. Marie-Louise's marriage was not just political, it was cruel. Charles was sickly, emotionally stunted, and physically unable to consummate the union. The teenage French princess wrote heartbreaking letters home, describing her isolation, her confusion, and her desperate attempts to find some purpose in Madrid's stifling court. She died young, at only 26 likely, from complications of depression and neglect. Her body broke under the weight of a life she was never allowed to shape. Then there's Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Empress of Russia, who was born as a German princess, Alex of Hesse, and married Tsar Nicholas II. Though not a direct product of sibling incest, Alexandra's ancestry still bore the heavy mark of intermarried European royalty. But it wasn't just biology that doomed her. It was the expectations of perfection. Her son Alexei was born with hemophilia, a genetic disease that many believe stemmed from Queen Victoria's lineage. Alexandra blamed herself. She turned inward toward mysticism and Rasputin, seeking salvation in visions and whispers, because science and prayer had failed her. She bore the full burden of dynasty, the need for an heir, the shame of a defect, and the terror of falling short. One historical fact that unites these women, no matter their country, century, or faith, is that royal daughters were rarely allowed to choose their spouse, and even more rarely allowed to refuse motherhood. Their bodies were diplomatic assets, vessels for treaties, walking guarantees of bloodline continuity. Whether they married at 12 or 22, whether they bore sons or lost every child, their role remained the same: sacrifice silently. And here's a haunting tidbit in the Mughal Empire. Some royal daughters were so central to their father's court that they were never married at all, not out of mercy but out of control. Princess Jahanara Begum, daughter of Emperor Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, was one such case. She lived as a powerful woman in the court, managing affairs, commissioning architecture, and advising her father, but she remained unmarried all her life. Scholars still debate whether this was a sign of empowerment or a deliberate choice by her father to keep her influence locked within the palace walls. Jahanara's diaries suggest she found spiritual meaning in her independence, but one can't help but wonder what she might have chosen had she been allowed. And what of the Rajput princesses of India's warrior clans, many of whom were married as children into rival royal families to ensure peace? The most famous is perhaps Jodha Bai, long romanticized as the wife of Mughal Emperor Akbar. But behind the poetry is a grim reality. She was a teenager, traded for an alliance, sent to a foreign court, where she likely never spoke the same language as her husband. She bore children, yes, but was she ever truly seen? Historians still argue whether women like Jodha Bai or Jahanara wielded real power or symbolic influence. In some cases, these women did carve out spaces for themselves, managing religious endowments, leading pilgrimages, even dictating political decisions from behind the veil. But in every case, their power was conditional, contingent, and endlessly surveilled. This is the legacy of royal inbreeding and dynastic marriage, not just the physical ailments we now trace in genetics, but the emotional inheritance of silence, submission, and loss. Every princess was a gamble. Would she survive childbirth? Would she bear a son? Would she keep quiet when ignored and smile when exiled? The deeper tragedy is not that so many of them suffered. It's that so few were remembered for it. Their names were footnotes. Their tombs were moved. Their portraits hung in galleries with no plaques describing what they gave up for the sake of empire. And it happened everywhere. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, princesses were often denied the right to leave the capital even after marriage. Some were married into secondary aristocratic clans, rather than royal equals, diluting their own bloodline by design to prevent rival claims. Their children would never rule. Their voices would never rise. Their names often disappeared from annals by the third generation, forgotten even in family trees. In Egypt in ancient times, pharaohs like Akhenaten and Tutankhamun married their own daughters or half-sisters. Some believe Nefertiti may have been related to her husband more closely than we imagine, though records remain incomplete. The temples show them standing side by side, radiant and divine, but the truth is far more somber. We now know that Tutankhamun's mummified remains show severe congenital defects, possibly due to close-kin marriage, club-foot cleft palate, and scoliosis among them. His brief reign and tragic health became the perfect, terrible metaphor for the limits of royal inbreeding. It is tempting to think this is all ancient history, that royal inbreeding and dynastic sacrifice have no place in the modern world. But even in the 20th century, echoes remained. The last Habsburg Emperor, Charles V, still married a close cousin. In 1938, Queen Elizabeth II's family tree still showed numerous interconnections with German and Russian royal houses. The desire to consolidate power and protect the bloodline persisted even as science began to sound the alarm. And what does all this tell you, lying here in your bed tonight, surrounded by silence and a soft ticking clock, that for centuries royal daughters were treated not as people, but as policies? Their choices were written before they learned to speak. Their paths were drawn in ink, long before they could read. And yet they lived. They found ways to leave footprints. In poems, in chapels, in hospital wings, they funded in portraits where they held their gaze just a little too directly. Sometimes their resistance was only in surviving quietly, gracefully, invisibly. But now you see them. Margarita Teresa remembered not only in her wedding lace or coffin velvet, but in the gleam of her child self in Las Meninas. Jahanara Begum, whose architectural marvels still cast shade on Delhi's streets. Marie-Louise, whose trembling letters crossed the Pyrenees too late. Mihrimah, who built mosques in her name when no one dared say it aloud. They were queens and nuns, priestesses and peacemakers, shadows and sparks. Their lives were rarely free, but they were lived. And so, as you prepare for the final stretch of this journey, breathe a little deeper. You've walked not just through palaces, but through prisons, through silk chambers, and beneath ceilings no one could break. The final gallery now awaits a room hung with portraits lit by quiet memory. You'll end where Margarita Teresa began, among paint and silence. You've wandered so far tonight through cedar-scented harems, orchid gardens, desert palaces, marble galleries, and every corridor has echoed the same soft refrain, daughters given, daughters spent. Now gently you drift back to where our long lullaby began, into a quiet Madrid gallery where Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas still waits. You know the room by heart now. High windows, fluted pilasters, the painter peering out from his easel. And there, immovable, unaging little Margarita Teresa, luminous beneath a pale cascade of brocade. Look at her once more. You can almost feel the hush around her, the pressure in her tiny shoulders. 1,000 tourists pass by every day, whispering about perspective lines and mirror tricks. But tonight you stand still because you understand that this picture is not just clever composition. It is the doorway into 5 centuries of borrowed girlhoods. Margarita's painted gaze becomes a prism through it. You have seen Cleopatra marry her brothers, Empress Tudu stand hushed behind jade screens, Mihrimah Sultan barter, freedom for an aging vizier, Alexandra Feodorovna pray over a bleeding son, and imperial priestesses of Japan die with poems on their tongues instead of kisses on their lips. Yet the weight of those stories is not meant to bury you in sorrow. It is meant to illuminate, because as dark as the pattern appears, each life you trace tonight flickered with stubborn humanity, tiny acts of resistance, bursts of generosity, secret gardens of orchids, hidden poems in marble mosques, signed in a woman's hand when custom said her hand should be invisible. It is one of history's quiet ironies. Dynasties obsessed with bloodline purity rarely notice the richer lifeblood of imagination flowing beneath their daughters' veils. Consider Margarita herself. Mainstream historians agree she never ruled anything beyond a nursery, that she died in 1673 carrying a stillborn child, that her widower Leopold I remarried within 8 months. And yes, those facts anchor her tragedy. But scholars still argue whether Velázquez painted her purely to flatter the crown or slyly to question the system that would eventually break her. Some art critics point to the slight tilt of her torso, an almost imperceptible lean away from the vortex of attendance, as if she's stepping out of her role for the briefest second to ask, "Is this really all I am?" That question may be her quiet revolt, preserved forever in oil and pigment. You can see similar micro-rebellions elsewhere if you look Cleopatra slipping into Egyptian speech. Though Greek was protocol, Princess Oku weaving coded grief into a waka about fallen cherry blossoms, Tudu opening famine granaries at her own expense, Fatma Sultan raising a white monkey in a garden that forbade women fresh conversation. Every empire believed it had contained its daughters, but the daughters always found a hairline crack, a place to breathe, a place to leave a fingerprint. And what came of the dynasties that guarded bloodlines so jealously? History answers bluntly. Most collapsed beneath the very weight they tried to protect. The Spanish Habsburgs ended with Margarita's brother, Charles II, jaw-locked, tongue-swollen mind, clouded sperm count non-existent. His childlessness sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a European earthquake that redrew borders and drained treasuries. The Ottoman sultans, once unassailable, dwindled into ceremonial puppets as daughters vanished behind lattice windows. The Ptolemies, masters of sibling wedlock, vanished when Cleopatra's final gamble failed against Rome's iron. Even the Russian Romanovs, tangled in cousin marriages, bled out in a cellar at Ekaterinburg, after Alexei's hemophilia chained an empire to Rasputin's whispers. So tonight you might reasonably ask, was any of it worth it? Did any kingdom truly last because a princess gave her life to a treaty? Did any empire endure because a girl agreed to deny her own name? The answer is painted all around you in crumbling palaces and abandoned titles. No, the walls fell, the crowns tarnished, and yet the small traces those women left the mosques, the poems, the hospital wings, the charity endowments, those remain. Stone by stone, word by word, they outlived the very systems that muted them. It turns out that empathy ages better than pedigree. That is the human lesson at the core of this sleepy history. Greatness measured purely in bloodline is fragile. Greatness nourished by compassion is persistent. Margarita's body failed the Habsburgs, but her image still moves millions. Mihrimah's mosque still calls to prayer in Istanbul, long after the viziers' names were forgotten. Tudu's famine granaries live on in Vietnamese folklore as symbols of royal kindness. Even Princess Oku's sorrowful verses survived earthquakes, fires, and the shogunates fall to land gently in modern anthologies, teaching new readers how to mourn gracefully. All of this flickers through your thoughts as you stare at Las Meninas for the final time tonight. You realize that the painter was not merely capturing court splendor. He was capturing the tension between symbol and soul. That tension hums softly across every dynasty, every time frame, every latitude you visited. And by listening, you have eased it a little by giving each woman back her narrative. You have shifted her from background to center, from footnote to first person. So let the final lights of the gallery dim. Let the hush settle over the waxed wood floors. Margarita Teresa, forever 5, stands watch beneath her heavy skirts. She does not move, but she does not fade either, because you are still here holding her story. And as long as someone remembers a piece of her will keep breathing long after empires are dust. Now breathe in slowly. Imagine the echoes of all those palaces dissolving into soft night air. The marble floors cool beneath your feet become warm sand, and then nothing at all, just the weightless comfort of your own bed. The candlelight of 100 courts melts into a single gentle glow on your nightstand. The distant chorus of ministers and tutors and court musicians fades to a faint lull like wind sifting through leaves outside your window. Exhale and feel the gowns, the crowns, the protocols slide off your shoulders. They are only stories. They cannot follow you here. What remains is quieter. The pulse of empathy you felt while walking alongside these women, the subtle understanding that every portrait hides an unwritten diary. Every title conceals a beating heart. Hold that understanding lightly. It doesn't need to be heavy. Let it glow soft and small like a firefly cupped in your palms. With your next breath, picture Margarita Teresa's gentle smile adjusting just for you, as if Velázquez painted an extra brushstroke tonight, a secret glimmer of gratitude. Hear Cleopatra's multilingual laughter ripple across a moonlit Nile. Smell Tudu's orchids opening in the dark, releasing sweetness into humid air. Feel Mihrimah's mosque courtyard cooling under starlight. They are at peace now, and so are you. Settle deeper into the pillow. Your heartbeat is a slow drum steady as centuries. Whatever weight you carried to bed tonight can rest beside these stories tucked away for morning. There is nothing required of you now. No treaty to honor, no throne to protect, no portrait to hold still for. Only sleep, only softness. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be light, your heart kind, and your dawn gentle.